Star Wars is a very good example of a franchise that purposefully appealed to all sorts of people. And you might not believe that, but it's true. I always laugh a little when I hear Star Wars is just for kids because to me that was one of the biggest marketing schemes in all of media. It's easier to get young kids to like things made for older fans than to do the opposite. And older fans will watch whatever they want while parents only take kids to see things you say were made for kids. But if you look at the writing in every Star Wars movie except one, it was actually all geared towards teenagers and very young adults. Every single movie except one revolves completely around 19 or 20-year-olds entering adulthood, leaving home, and going out into the real world for the first time. And I'm not saying this isn't also for kids, because it is, but it's clearly also for people who'd identify with those issues in real life. You can be pretentious and narrow-minded and say they're movies with space wizards and laser swords, but that's like saying Game of Thrones is a show with sword fights and dragons. You'd say, but the sex and violence makes it an adult show, but then this focus on entering adulthood can also make Star Wars a franchise for young adults. And if you still don't believe it, or you just want to ignore all that, then just look at the very first movie. Not the prequels, not anything that comes later. There are tons of archived news shots of people lining up for blocks and blocks to see the very first movie in 1977. And even from the beginning, the overwhelming majority of the people you see in those pictures or those videos were not young kids. Even from the beginning, it's clear a very sizable portion, if not most of the audience, were already in their teens to their 20s. And that shouldn't be surprising because sci-fi and fantasy aren't exclusively for young kids. And even with the space magic and the laser swords, the fact that these were live-action movies that weren't afraid to touch on some fairly serious topics whenever they wanted was clearly enough to appeal to older kids and older fans. It's just that they also presented all this and made all this as kid-friendly as possible, and they made sure it also appealed to younger kids. And really, stories that revolve around teenagers or young adults are stories that have the best of both worlds because these can appeal to just about everyone. They're not bogged down by any sort of dialogue or any thought processes you might try to take on when the characters are young kids. So it's much more believable that these characters would be three-dimensional and intelligent enough to carry more complicated stories. And young kids can always find the more fantastical or exciting sides of the stories they can enjoy, while people who are actually that age in real life have characters they can personally identify with. But people who are even older can still relate to these characters who remind them of themselves or things they've gone through when they were younger, because the characters are at least conscious and mature enough for them to identify with on some basic level.